Hi there, my name is Siobhan Britton and the title of my talk is Object-Based Learning Without the Objects, Special Collections Teaching in the COVID-19 Era. So a bit of background, I'm a librarian at Chelsea College of Arts, University of the Arts London, and in our library we've got some amazing special collections, including our collection of artist books. Just a quick definition of artist books. As the name suggests, they're books that are created, conceptualised and published by artists. And they can range from very lo-fi, photocopied, sort of basic DIY aesthetic publications to very high-end, limited edition, expensive books. Teaching object-based learning sessions using these collections to the students that I support has always been a key part of my job. I work with graphic design and fine art students as their course librarian. Sometimes I do sign-up sessions and induction sessions that are quite sort of generic and open, and other times the sessions I run are more bespoke and are often designed in collaboration with staff that teach on the courses, in particularly to sort of support the units that the students are studying on. However, in March 2020, everything was turned upside down when the university buildings closed and we moved to working remotely because of COVID. I no longer had access to material in the collections, but I did have a number of special collection sessions booked in for the following months. So why did I not just cancel the session? Why did I start thinking about ways to deliver them online instead? Well, first of all, visual literacy is really important for our students, particularly as art and design students, and working with special collections was a really great way for them to develop their visual literacy through object-based learning. I've always been really inspired by the work of Kirsten Hardy from Arts University Bournemouth and the work with museum-based collections to promote object-based learning and visual literacy skills. And this was the kind of teaching I was doing with the physical collections at Chelsea. Even though the physical collections were out of bounds, I thought that the thematic questions that come up in these sessions around ideas about authorship, production, knowledge dissemination, etc., the ones that our students often think about in terms of their own artistic practices, and it would have been a big loss if we hadn't have facilitated that in some capacity. COVID-19 has continued to disrupt face-to-face teaching, and it's likely that blended learning is very much going to be the future of how we work, in my case. Developing these sessions so that they could be taught online seemed like a good idea for the future. And indeed, we were back working off-site between January and March, so it was really good to have these sessions. It was really good to have these sessions available online. Special collection sessions have always been very positively received by students, and students seem to really enjoy them. They're very interactive and students engage and talk a lot in them, and I thought it would be great if we could keep that kind of going online. And finally, at the time, I was studying for my PG Cert qualification, and designing and delivering an online special collection session became the focus of my final major project. And that's what I'm actually going to be talking about here today, and it's the sort of focus of this presentation, what I did, how I did it, and what the students thought about it, and sort of plans I have hopefully for the future. So identifying content for the session. I drew on existing session plans that I had taught before and my specialist subject knowledge, and researched artists interested in the internet as source material, and also artists who were interested in digital publication when I was looking for material to use in the session. I found the work of Paul Solelis, who's a critic, curator, artist and designer who writes on the idea of radical electronic publishing and artist publications, really useful here. And it helped me identify a number of artists who were making this kind of work that I decided to use in the session. I tried to pick material that would bring up questions around what artist publications can be, and would spark discussions between the differences and perhaps sometimes similarities between print and digital. I began to see the material that I was selecting as digital objects that could be used through the session in perhaps similar ways to how we might use physical material to teach these students visual literacy skills. So I kind of saw them almost as exact analogues, but sort of objects that could be used in a similar way despite the fact they were digital. In the end, there were three main strands of material that I selected for the session. Firstly, material that was made for print but had been digitized. In this case, an artist's book by Erica Van Horn called Gifts from the Government that had been fully digitized by Yale University. I also looked at artists who created publications using material that was generated online. I looked at an artist called Guthrie Lonergan, who made a book called 93.1 FM Jack FM Los Angeles, which is both a print and online book that uses scraped radio data from an LA radio station to make a book. And the third category of items that I included for the session were featured artists who create experimental, fully online, born digital publications. In this case, an artist and writer called Alan Bigelow, who made a multimedia visual text and sound publication called Pangram, and two newish literary and art collectives, Dwelling and Signal House Editions, who publish online internet in quite interesting ways. I'm going to post links to all the artists mentioned here and the session plan with the supplementary material. So for the session, so you can have a look at those alongside this to get an idea of how the session was structured and to look at the material I was showing the students. Then I thought about how I could encourage engagement in the session, because as I previously said, special collection sessions have always been ones where students talk and engage a lot within the group and sort of share their thoughts, and that often shapes the way that the session develops, actually. In fact, when things moved online, it became more difficult to keep that level of engagement up. I was noticing that in the other teaching that I was doing, and I wanted to try and keep that in the online sessions that I was going to run. So I thought I would use Padlet, which I'd used before, to try and do this. I asked the students to do two tasks with Padlet as part of the session. They were asked to read a digitized artist book, the Erica Van Horn book, and share what they thought about the experience of reading the book online. And for the second task, I asked them to consider and share how the Alan Bigelow Pangram experimental publication would fit with their perception of what an artist's publication or book could be. And I did that to try and get them to share their views and opinions of, what artist publications could be, what they might think they're not, and hope so that we could turn those thoughts into a discussion in the session. And I found Noffencheck's work on using inquiry-based learning really useful here, as it informed my choice to use this as an activity. So then actually ran the session. It ran it in March this year, and in the end it was an hour long, and 14 BA Fine Arts students attended. Students were shown the previously mentioned material as part of the session and participated in the Padlet tasks, which they engaged really well with. Their input created some really interesting discussions about artists' books and digital publishing. On the slide, you can see some of the responses that were added to the Padlet when they were talking about how the experimental publication fitted into their own ideas of what artists' publications and books could be. Lots of interesting comments about, what they thought books were, what they thought they weren't, which sort of showed their own kind of parameters and understanding of the material, and I think sometimes challenged that in the session as well. So I was really pleased with that input, and I think that overall the session went really well. And so what did the students think? So in terms of student feedback, I'd also asked the students to talk about the idea of reading a digitized printed artist book. And it was really interesting to see that although they seemed to miss looking at physical books and seeing the printed special collections material, there were some positives also around being able to look at the book whenever they liked online and it being more accessible in some ways. I followed up the session with a survey, and what was in the comments on the Padlet wall, such as the comments shown here, were sort of echoed in the survey, the sort of feelings towards working with digital rather than physical material. Although the majority of students felt they missed out a little by not being able to work with the physical collections, all the students found the session interesting or very interesting and enjoyed the tasks that asked for their input. So next steps. Since running the session in March. I've taught it a number of times with other groups of students, and feedback's always been very positive. Sometimes I've adapted the session slightly and changed some of the material in it, but the structure has always broadly remained the same. In an environment where blended learning is very much the future, it's been really good to develop these online sessions. And I've actually been thinking a lot about how they might work alongside our object-based learning ones with physical material from the collection, perhaps running them as part of a series where we look at print and digital, and they're linked to each other more explicitly using the physical material and the digital material. So thinking about how the two things could complement each other, because I definitely think that's possible. And special collections can seem quite rarefied sometimes, and processes to access them can be off-putting for some students. And I think online sessions could help to challenge that, which is great, and make our collections more accessible. It's a good way of building awareness of what we have in the collections too. It's really interesting to run these sessions with larger groups. It's a relatively small group that I worked with, and I also think if I had more than an hour, I would try and add more interactive activities into the session. I was a bit wary of adding more than 2 activities, where I asked the students for input, because it was an hour-long session, and I felt like to really process and get sort of stuff out of asking for their interaction, that seemed like a suitable level for the session of the time I had. If I had more time, yeah, I would definitely try and add more interactive activities, but it's the sort of typical curse of the one-shot information literacy session, definitely one of the sort of limitations of it. And I would love to hear from other library workers who've been teaching online with special collections over the last year and a bit. It would be really interesting to hear what you've been doing, what you think works well, what's been a challenge, because it's really good to share our practices. So with that, thank you very much. I'll leave it at that. That's the end of my presentation. I hope it was interesting, and I'm looking forward to the session at the event, and hopefully we'll be able to discuss some of the things I've spoken about here. However, if you have got any questions, you can always send me an email. My email address is just here on the slide. So, yep, thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to seeing you at the event. Goodbye.